Dutch and Flemish 21st Century Children's Literature on the Holocaust, teaching history lessons for the present and the future. Dutch language children's and young adult literature on the Holocaust, produced in the Netherlands and Flanders in the 21st century, is opulent. The corpus, compiled under the Kochlit 21 project, comprises almost 70 books for a young readership, and these texts are generically varied and intended for different age groups. In this chapter, I present an overview of this corpus to identify the ways in which its items fulfill the educational function characteristically ascribed to children's literature. Before doing that, I briefly discuss the Holocaust-themed Dutch language literature of the 20th century, with a view to capturing the distinctiveness of more recent children's literature addressing this subject matter and the changes in the presentation of the Holocaust in writings for the young reading public. I also depict today's modes of narrating the Holocaust for young readers. Subsequently, I discuss in more detail two books: The War Between These Walls, written by Aline Sachs and illustrated by Cyril Strzelecki, and Finks War by Benny Lindelauff, representing Flemish and Dutch literature respectively. The characteristic differences between these two books exemplify the specificity of Holocaust representations in the two cultural areas and modes of addressing the Holocaust as a theme in today's Flemish and Dutch writings. This overview of children's Holocaust literature, published in the Netherlands and Flanders in the 21st century, offers a fair glimpse of its opulence and diversity, particularly when compared with prior representations of the Holocaust in Dutch language literature for a young readership. This body of writing crucially includes informational books. Many of them are richly illustrated, both with pictures and with photographs. The strong presence of visual narrative is what sets the latest children's literature on the Holocaust apart from its 20th century iterations. The visual component is most pronounced by definition in graphic novels, picture books, and comics, genres relatively newly mobilized in Holocaust literature. Reliance on the image appears to be more distinctive to Flemish literature about the Holocaust, both in comic books and in more artsy ventures. The function of directly presenting the Holocaust events, which was fulfilled by mimetic narratives authored by the witnesses of the Holocaust in the 20th century, is taken over by photographs in 21st century writings, which are literary representations of the Holocaust. Happy endings are becoming increasingly less mandatory as the 21st century progresses. The pressing need for education is acknowledged and often handled by institutions. Authors collaborate with institutions which commission texts based on authentic records. More than half of the books in the corpus employ authentic materials, which appear not only in informational non-fiction books, but also in historical fiction and in fiction novels. At least two aims are identifiable in education underpinned by 21st century children's literature that addresses the Holocaust. One of them is to convey historical knowledge, and the other is to discuss the current state of the society, which many authors and educators do by using the history of the Holocaust as a starting point. As a general conclusion, the image of the child in Dutch and Flemish societies is transforming, and the literature about the Holocaust has to play its role in this process. Even this brief and fragmentary examination of the corpus yields the image of the child as an increasingly full-fledged participant in the society. If there is something against which to protect the child, is not so much drastic images from the past as the future in which these could flash out again.
At present, Arnon Grunberg is one of the most prolific Dutch novelists of the Netherlands. His first book, Blue Mondays, is a typical second-generation novel. Since that debut, he publishes a novel roughly every other year, not to mention daily and weekly columns in journals, theatre plays, blogs, and reports as an embedded journalist. He has been translated in 28 languages. His oeuvre is not only vast, but also a rather complicated one. Arnon Grunberg was born in 1971. His mother was a survivor of Auschwitz. His father survived in hiding. Thus, Arnon seemed to be the embodiment of the second generation. And his first novel, Blue Mondays, testifies to that. It appeared in 1994 and received much public acclaim. At the same time, Grunberg resisted, in a provocative way, the secularization of Holocaust literature and Holocaust survivors and their children. 7 novels, and 20 years later, in 2004, he wrote The Jewish Messiah, in some editions proclaiming itself in the subtitle as The Great Yiddish Novel. The main character is a Swiss teenager, Xavier. He is the grandson of a German concentration camp guard. Xavier, on the one hand, feels strangely attracted to his portrait photo, and on the other hand, feels the appeal of the Jewish people, whom he wants to comfort for their suffering over the ages. He befriends a rabbi's son, Avromele, and he even wants to be circumcised. And because that operation would be too costly in a hospital, Avromele introduces him to an old Jew who used to be a mohel, a ritual circumciser. The man is clearly half blind, and his room is far from clean, to put it mildly. Not surprisingly, the whole undertaking goes horribly wrong, and Xavier nearly dies from the ensuing infection. It costs him one of his testicles, which he from then on carries with him in a jar, referring to it as King David. The mohel is hunted down by a group of civic vigilantes against pedophiles. The whole affair takes up 100 pages, like 1/5 of the novel. Xavier and Avromele decide to translate Mein Kampf into Yiddish and publish it as The Great Yiddish Novel. They engage in a homosexual relationship, but from embarrassment or guilt, promise each other that they won't really feel anything for the other. They move from Switzerland to Amsterdam, where Xavier is admitted to the art academy, but he is not successful, and he gets the advice to change to photography. Avromele wanders around in the streets and has a lot, and that is really a lot, of one-night stands, because as a Jew he can't say no, according to his own explanation. Next, they immigrate to Israel. In less than 70 pages, about 14% of the book, the rest of the story is told in tearing rush. How Xavier works as a photographer and then speechwriter for politicians, how he climbs up through manipulation and blackmail, how, as a prime minister, he sells the atomic bomb to various unreliable countries all over the world, like Turkey, Colombia, Bangladesh, how he negotiates with the leader of Hamas, how he has a bomb aimed at Amsterdam with the text, "Greetings from Anne Frank," and how, finally, Xavier, alone with his dogs in the government bunker, pushes the red button. Clearly, the similarities of Xavier and Hitler, who is rumored to have had only one testicle, who was turned down by the Art Academy in Vienna, was a great orator, and died by suicide in his bunker after having killed his dog. Those similarities are highly provocative. What to make of this grotesque novel? Sacrilege, wild provocation, furious protest against hypocrisy, such as the hypocrisy of Jewish orthodoxy, of philo-Semitism, of civic vigilantes, self-irony, boisterous humor, playful parody of Holocaust literature. Scenes of ridicule and mockery do also contain wise insights and serious criticism on, for instance, Jewish religion, the human mind, or political events of the time. Yet, this does not make up for the fact that the novel fails, deliberately fails, in achieving in the reader the willing suspension of disbelief, as the poet Coleridge so aptly defined the mental attitude of readers of fiction. Neither in the plotline nor in the psychology of the main characters is the novel able to keep up even the appearance of probability. In general, the Jewish Messiah was well received in the Netherlands, but the critique was not unequivocally favorable. Words like provocation, satirical, bizarre, malicious, and absurd often figure in the reviews. When we try to distinguish patterns in the various reviews, it seems clear that most critics try their best to understand and defend the blatantly transgressional nature of the novel. Many agree that the composition is weak, as if the author rushed the last part to bring the book to an end. Christian critics object to the intensely dark worldview, and some other reviewers wonder if Grunberg could ever come with another novel after this one. Since the Jewish Messiah, Arnold Grunberg developed more and more into a public intellectual, and in that role he strongly identified himself as a Jew and as the son of Holocaust survivors, though never afraid of taking an unusual or unexpected position. In a public lecture in 2007, he warns against tendency to reduce one's identity to a single one, to belonging to one group only. I quote, "Those who voluntarily or involuntarily reduce themselves to members of a single community know who the enemies of that community are and accept their real or perceived enmity. Those who are not for us are against us. Paranoia is a symptom of the disease called singular identity, like fever is a symptom of flu." End of quote. In 2020, Grunberg published a large anthology of literature from and about Auschwitz. In the introduction, he shows great knowledge of the genre of testimony, not only of the literature itself, how else could he have composed an anthology, but also of the most important theoretical works on camp literature. To top it all off, in that same year, 2020, Grunberg delivered the traditional speech at a national commemoration of the dead, an extra honorable assignment because of the 75th anniversary of the liberation. This annual speech by a well-known politician, writer, or artist in a way expresses the national conscience. In the last decades, It mostly stays away from heroism and often contains some kind of confession of guilt and moral appeal. In fragments of this speech, we can hear echoes from the Jewish Messiah. I quote, "Commemoration is always also a way of acknowledging who you do not wish to be, but who you nevertheless believe you can become. No commemoration without this fearful suspicion, no meaningful commemoration without a well-founded fear that we are the future perpetrators and their helpers." End of quote. Today, it certainly is no less true than it was in 2020. Must we conclude that the more traditional outlook of the Holocaust and Holocaust literature caught up with him? And what could have brought this turn about? Immersing himself in testimonies on the concentration camps may have had an unexpected effect. Will this change be a definite one in his work? Recently, Grunberg stated in an interview that he is very fond of the grotesque genre, and that he regrets that that element is mostly lacking in his present work. Yet, to me, it seems unlikely that he will apply the grotesque form on the Holocaust again.
Hello, my name is Chris van Heukelom and I'm a professor of cultural studies at KU Leuven in Belgium. I'm also one of the contributors to the edited volume on contemporary Holocaust literature. In this presentation, I will briefly highlight some trends and developments in Dutch language literature about the Holocaust of the past quarter of a century, with a particular focus on the Flemish case. Although the same language, Dutch, is spoken and written in the Netherlands and the northern part of Belgium, Flanders, there are major differences between the two areas in the way the theme of the Holocaust has found its way into the domain of literature in the long post-war period. The main reason for this is the diverging degree of integration of Jewish writers and artists into the socio-cultural fabric of both countries. Although there was a substantial group of Jews residing in both the Netherlands and Belgium on the eve of the Second World War, which was reinforced by the significant influx from Nazi Germany in the 1930s, the Jewish community in Belgium came into being only towards the end of the 19th century. And the integration of these Jewish newcomers was much more economically than culturally oriented, particularly in the northern Dutch-speaking part of the country, concentrated around the Antwerp diamond trade. In this sense, the Dutch language diary of Anne Frank, which has become an iconic piece of Holocaust literature across the globe, is exemplary of the differences between the Netherlands and Flanders. While Anne Frank's war diary opens a long series of Dutch language ego documents and literary works by Holland-based Jews affected by the Holocaust, Jewish writers who have written about their Holocaust experience can barely be found in Flanders. In this regard, it's undoubtedly significant that the Flemish author who has written the most about the concentration camps is a non-Jewish resistance fighter who survived Dachau, Ludo van Eck, and that his comprehensive body of works on the camps, with the so-called The Book of the Camps, Het Boek der Kampen from 1969, being its culminating point, enjoys only limited fame and recognition in Flanders. What's more, the rather marginal status of Van Eck's work in the literary field has much to do with the fact that the Flemish canon of war-themed literature consists largely of works dealing with the collaboration and repression suffered by Flemish collaborators after the Second World War. A very recent example is Jeroen Olieslager's novel Will from 2016, which revolves around the active involvement of the Antwerp police force in anti-Jewish raids during Nazi occupation in the city of Antwerp. There are, however, some exceptions that confirm or deviate from the general rule. A case in point is Terug op de plaats die ik nooit heb verlaten, Back in the place I never left, a long prose poem written in Dutch in which the Polish-born Antwerp Jew Tobias Schiff looks back at his turbulent camp experiences in the 1940s. Published in 1999, a couple of years before the author's death, and for some time recommended reading in high schools across Flanders, Schiff's poetic account is one of the rare Flemish Jewish ego documents on the Holocaust that have achieved a certain status in Flanders. What's more, the publication of the first edition of the book in the late 1990s more or less coincided with the appearance of a series of other Flemish books that thematically move away from wartime collaboration and early post-war repression. Instead, they focus on the predicament of persecuted Jews during the Second World War. While most of the writers involved do not have a Jewish background, particularly worth mentioning here are two Flemish authors who do have Jewish ancestry, both on the paternal side. A contemporary of Tobias Schiff is the popular crime author Bob Mendes, who lost his father Benjamin in the camps and who barely escaped deportation to Auschwitz himself. In his widely read and critically acclaimed thrillers, the Antwerp-based Mendes, born to a family of Jewish Portuguese descent, usually avoided the fraught subject of the Holocaust, moving the topic to the forefront of his work only when he was already in his 70s. A case in point is the historical novel De Smaak van Vrijheid, The Taste of Freedom, in 1999, which revolves around the wartime fortunes of a Jewish protagonist called Megin Friedman. The very same year, 1999, also saw the publication of Joseph Pierce's well-received literary debut entitled Land van Belofte, een familiekroniek, Land of Promise, a Family Chronicle. Based on his family tree and year of birth, 1951, Pierce belongs to the so-called second generation, but the story of his Jewish family is anything but typical, certainly not for the Flemish context. Pierce's father, Vernon Pierce, was born in 1922 under the name Werner Peritz into a largely assimilated Jewish family in Breslau, then in Germany, but was sent by his parents to the United Kingdom in 1938 to avoid Nazi persecution. After a turbulent odyssey at the beginning of the Second World War, including deportation to Australia, Peretz took part in the 1944 liberation of Belgium as a British soldier, under the English name Vernon Pierce, during which he struck up a relationship with a Flemish girl from a Catholic middle-class family in Vilvoorde, a provincial town close to Brussels. As the oldest son born out of this inter-ethnic marriage, Joseph Pierce didn't learn that he had Jewish roots on his father's side until the mid-1960s, on the day he turned 14. Remarkably, Pierce decided to go in search of his Jewish roots only much later in life, in the 1990s, when he had already completed a 20-year career as an English teacher in an Antwerp high school. Since his literary debut in 1999, Pierce has published a dozen of books, fiction and non-fiction alike, 4 of which are partly or largely devoted to the fortunes of his Jewish family in the long 20th century. Although Pierce's father and his Jewish grandparents spent the Second World War outside continental Europe and thus didn't experience the Holocaust up close, the theme does occupy an important place in his work, not least because dozens of the author's relatives ultimately did not survive the war. By literary critics, Pierce is usually considered an exponent of of so-called Flemish genealogical prose, a literary phenomenon that became a booming trend in the last quarter of the 20th century, and that continues to resonate within the Flemish literary field. It encompasses an extensive body of now more than 100 novels in which a literary quest for the personal identity and individual past of the narrator goes hand in hand with a broader reflection on the collective identity of Flemish and national history. What makes Pierce stand out within the genealogical genre is the fact that, because of his father's Jewish, German, British background, he succeeds in providing the usually rather local and regional perspective on the development of a Flemish identity in the aftermath of the Second World War with a distinctly transnational and even global dimension. What's more, with respect to the legacy of the Holocaust, Pierce's approach can be called, with a term borrowed from Eva Hoffmann, contrapuntal. Because of his mixed Flemish-Jewish background, his work not only acknowledges the prominent role of collaboration and repression in Flemish collective memory, namely the perspective of the perpetrators and their local helpers, but it also extensively incorporates the turbulent fate of European Jewry throughout the long 20th century, namely the perspective of the victims and their offspring. In his early books, Pierce accomplishes this strategy by time and again shifting spatial and geographical perspectives. While his literary debut, Land of Promise, from 1999, revolves around the fortunes of his Jewish relatives scattered around the world, his first novel, Koloniale Waren, Colonial Wares, from 2001, shifts focus to the coming of age of Pierce's juvenile alter ego in a Flemish Catholic shopkeeper's family in the 1960s. His next novel, Maanzaad, Poppy Seeds, from 2002, in turn foregrounds the tragic life story of his Jewish grandmother Else Peretz, who committed suicide in Bolivia in the late 1940s, portrayed in the book as Giselle Friedman. By way of contrast, Pierce's third novel, Met je bal de vuisten, with clenched fists, from 2004, relocates the action once again to his hometown Vilvoorde in the form of a Flemish family chronicle spanning the entire 20th century and no less than 4 generations. The Jewish perspective again takes center stage in Pierce's fifth novel, Vaderland, which illuminates the fortunes of 5 generations of the Löwenthal family, set on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean and covering almost 2 centuries. Pierce's genealogical approach comes full circle in his most recent book, Tussen Oder en Zenne, 2 rivieren, 2 grootvaders, 2 wereldoorlogen. Between Oder and Zenne, 2 rivers, 2 grandfathers, 2 world wars, from 2022. Instead of the autobiographically inspired fiction from his novels, Pierce returns to the non-fiction approach applied in his acclaimed literary debut, Land of Promise. What's more, the contrapuntal approach is now integrated into a long chronological narrative within the framework of one book. Pierce constantly goes back and forth between Breslau and Vilvoorde, following the lives of both his grandfathers, Jozef van den Brande and Felix Peretz, from birth around 1890 to their deaths in the late 1940s, with a particular focus on the Second World War, which spans 2 chapters and more than 60 pages in the book. With specific regard to the war and the Holocaust, it's important to note here that the intelligently composed contrapuntal genealogical account developed by Pierce in between Oder and Zenne deviates from the prototypical subject positions that tend to dominate narratives of victimhood and perpetration in cultural production. Although before the war, the Van den Brandes sympathized with the radical right-wing Flemish National Union, from 1940 onwards the leading collaborationist force in Flanders, they kept far enough away from involvement with the German occupiers to be called collaborators or helpers. Most members of the Peretz family, in turn, managed to leave continental Europe in time to escape Holocaust victimhood. Now, if we compare Pierce's approach with the provocative attitude of the Dutch writer Arnon Grunberg, it's difficult not to see the huge differences between Pierce's thoughtful and connection-seeking genealogical prose and Grunberg's strong focus on literary themes and devices such as transgression, intergenerational conflict, and the grotesque, especially in his early works about his Jewish background. By way of conclusion, I would like to stress that Joseph Pierce is one of the very few Flemish writers with Jewish roots to have given the theme of the Holocaust a personal face in the Flemish literary and cultural landscape of the past 2 decades. Moreover, after his literary debut in 1999, Piers has been closely affiliated with the Flemish quality newspaper De Morgen for almost 20 years, having authored in that capacity some 200 reviews and interviews, very often on Jewish themes, and often also on historical topics such as the Second World War and the Holocaust. As a writer of both fiction and non-fiction about the long 20th century, Piers's most significant achievement is undoubtedly the fact that by unearthing a wide variety of individual life stories, his genealogical prose has managed to reveal the diversity and multiplicity of subject positions in times of great political, geopolitical upheaval, and the extreme and less extreme experiences of pain, loss, and uprooting that went along with it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, my name is Sylwia Karolak. I work at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan and in the project 21st Century Literature and the Holocaust, a comparative and multilingual perspective, I research and describing the newest Polish language narrations for children and young adults. After the year 2000, the Polish publishing market saw a notable increase in Holocaust-related publications aimed at children and young adults. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, more books on the Holocaust for younger audiences were published than in the 6 post-war decades of the 20th century. The surge is certainly significant. The changes leading to this were gradual, beginning in the 1980s, a period marked by Polish culture and literature grappling with the Holocaust narrative. Almost half a century has passed since then, witnessing significant events, including advancements in the Polish research on the Holocaust, primarily history and literary studies, with memoirs published by the children of the Holocaust. During this time, there was a generational shift. The inherited narratives of post-memory began to take precedence over direct survivor memory, World War II transitioned from living memory to a subject of cultural memory, becoming part of the curriculum in Polish schools when it comes to Polish language classes as well as history classes. This period also saw a revival of cultural pedagogy and a growing appreciation of intercultural education. Finally, significant changes occurred in Polish children's literature in terms of subject matter and scholarly research. Since the turn of the 20th century, genres such as detective fiction and romance have been present in this literature. In addition, topics previously absent, tabooed, and reserved for adults have appeared, such as human anatomy and physiology, existence, and difficult borderline situations and phenomena, such as homophobia, disabilities, illnesses, death, or last but not least, war and Holocaust. Collection of Polish publications on the Holocaust for children and young adults is a novel addition to the broader spectrum of Polish Holocaust literature and has a distinctive character. The form and nature of these works, to a greater or lesser extent, are shaped by several factors. Firstly, the challenges faced by culture and literature when confronting the subject of the Holocaust, both in its content and visual representation. Secondly, the use of post-memory narratives by authors, adding a unique layer to their specificity. Thirdly, the Polish context within which these works are created and disseminated. Fourthly, the cognitive and comprehension limitations related to the competence of the non-adult reader, the modern reader of these works. These factors necessitate an adaptation of historical content to suit the age and cognitive abilities of the intended audience, consequently influencing the portrayal of the Holocaust in these publications. In Poland, Holocaust-related books for children and young adults have been received an extensive reception, encompassing interpretations and discussions that are both approving and critical as well as analytical and synthesizing approaches, from reviews of individual works to problematic studies of a greater number of works. Considerable research attention was devoted to the graphic elements of these works. There have been efforts to classify them generically, distinguishing, for example, between initiation novels and novels for girls. This corpus of research has been utilized in diverse ways. It has pointed to the use of the conventions of science fiction, fairy tales and fables. It was pointed to the function of animal protagonists. It has questioned whether children should be taught about the war and the Holocaust at all. It has asked whether it is better to taboo certain content in order not to traumatize young readers. And it has shown how ideology can influence the image of the Holocaust portrayed in literature. The multiplicity of research and the thematic breadth of the reflection accompanying publications for children and young adults on the Holocaust attests to the significance of this body of work in Poland. The importance of this work is undoubtedly indicated by the critical readings and accompanying postulations. This movement of thought, whether of approval, polemic, or even negation, undoubtedly paves the way for the further development of this literature. Thank you.
Sławomir Jacek Żurek, John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin. My paper is Recent Polish Literature After 2000 as a Place After Jews. In recent Polish literature, the victims of the Holocaust are still alive. They have been textually resurrected in Polish cities, towns and villages, restored to the local landscape with its forests, fields, rivers, ponds and lakes. This is a literary signaling of the continued experience of Jewish life in the subsequence of Poles, whose attitudes and emotion, often negative, stemming from fears with various origins, are clearly influenced by the felt presence. Literary characters come out from underground, speak from the watery depths, and circulate in the air as if to remind us of what chemically was or still is present in our surroundings: ashes, bones, decaying organic matter, and somewhere in the atmospheres, those who once rose up into the sky along with the smoke from crematoria. The artifactual presence of Jews in recent Polish literature, however, is linked to specific places, people, events that are part of an ontic order dating back more than 80 years. Place After Pogrom, Part 1. The first trend relating to the presence of murdered Jews in 21st century Polish literature can be defined by means of a category proposed by Marta Tomczak, post-Jedwabne narratives. This term refers to a broad trend in Polish prose, referring directly to Jan Tomasz Gross' book Land Historical Essay Neighbors 2001, as well as the response, especially the negative responses, this publication provoked in the Polish public sphere and which assumed the form of a broad-based, even national discussion, oftentimes highly emotional and largely pseudo-historical, on the historical role in the Holocaust of Poles and members of other nations that made up the Second Polish Republic, 1918-1945. This group of works includes many novels and short stories, but I would like to pay attention only at a few ones of them. Jedwabne thus became a buzzword for talking about the problem of the Holocaust in the Polish countryside in general on a number of levels. All of these in turn became the subject of research by both Polish historians and literary scholars. An example of a novel that only marginally attempts to reconstruct the historical events of Jedwabne or to hold its perpetrators accountable is Józef Hen's novel Ping Pong Player. Through a psychological study of individual characters, the book provides a canvas for understanding the mechanisms that led to the pogrom, the situation in which its victims found themselves, and the consequences of these crimes, reaching all the way to the present day. The next important book is the novel Żydówska, Jewish, by Stanisław Gromadzki. Also, the book is set in the present day. Historical events evoked by the narrative provide the canvas on which events play out. In this way, truths are articulated about how successive generations of Podlasie residents have avoided addressing questions concerning the Holocaust and the role Poles played in it. Jewish is full of anti-Jewish, that is, anti-Judaic and anti-Semitic myths promulgated by the former and present-day resident of Podlasie. The last example in this area is the drama Nasza klasa, Our Class by Tadeusz Słobodzianek. It refers directly to the events of Jedwabne and to the place itself. The work depicts events that take place among a group of schoolmates, both Poles and Jews, who in the face of the July 1941 pogrom became either victims, Jews, or oppressors, Poles. Most of the Jewish characters in the drama die as a result of various oppressive actions. They are stoned, beaten, tortured, raped, and eventually burned in a burn. The post-war fate of Poles involved in the murder, also shown in the play, is full of tragic twists and turns resulting from the crime. The few Jewish characters who managed to survive had an inner imperative to seek revenge after the war. They want to punish their Polish oppressors. Place after Ghetto Part 2. One space that often appears in the recent Polish Holocaust literature is modern-day Muranów, a district of Warsaw rebuilt after the war in a socialist realist style. The district is also a place after ghetto, the term of Jacek Leociak, having been built on the ruins of former Jewish quarter that had developed dynamically from the mid-19th century up until World War II. After 1939, this district grew in population as a result of the resettlement policies of the German occupational authority in the so-called general government, which created a closed ghetto in this district. The most interesting portrayals of the district in Polish literary works after 2000 include Beata Homontkowska, Stacja Muranów, Muranów Station, Igor Ostachowicz's Noc Żywych Żydów, Night of the Living Jews, and the short story Muranów from Sylwia Hutnik's W Krainie Czarów, in the Wonderland. In these works, as in the case of novels related to places after pogrom, these areas are shown not from a historical perspective, but in their present-day state. In Muranów, all traces of Jewish life there had been wiped out, first by the Germans and later by the new communist authorities, who implemented a redevelopment plan in the area. Thus, in the late 40s and early 50s, completely new streets were laid out there and houses were built in a socialist realist style that bore no resemblance to the original ones. Homontowska writes that only due to the monuments there thus the former Jewish quarter continued to demand recognition of its existence. She presents many voices of different people who spin story about pre-war and post-war Muranów. As Homontkowska writes, the neighborhood descends pre-war residents are those assigned to live with them by the Nazi for the duration of the ghetto existence, are still waiting in buried basements for the war to end. For the time being, they are asleep. The next author, Sylwia Hutnik, who during her childhood in the 70s lived with her parents in Muranów, wrote the short story Muranu, devoted eternally to the former Jewish quarter. The story is grotesque in character because this is how the author wants to show the attitude of Muranów's current residents toward their Jewish predecessors. How do the Polish modern-day residents of Muranów explain the tragedy of the Jews during the Holocaust? By the fact that they were lazy. They simply didn't want to run away. And now, because of them, Muranów has become a place of horror. Muranów, as Hutnik writes, is bricks failing, spooks at night, stories oozing from the mouth of the staircase. Muranów, therefore, continues to be filled with Jewish hungry ghosts, Jewish demons, the Jewish dragons sitting underground, wailing and restless with boredom. Since 43. Another example of the presence of the place after ghetto topos is novel Noc Żywych Żydów, Night of the Living Jews by Igor Ostachowicz. His protagonist, Tyler with a university degree, lives with his female partner in a block of flats in Muranów. Like most Warsaw residents, he is completely unaware of the historical significance of this part of the city. This state of affairs ends when Jews, in the form of zombies, begin to emerge from under the basement of his house, becoming an unexpected element of present-day Warsaw. Tyler undergoes an evolution. He transforms from an anti-Semite into a Jewish warrior and becomes the leader of the Jewish zombies. He joins the fight, getting behind the wheel of a giant truck, which he drives into the crowd of anti-Semites gathered in front of a mall. He is like the hidden Jewish messiah confronting Gog and Magog. Tyler dies, but with the knowledge that he actually won because he managed to win against himself, the devil, the Germans, and his own people. Place after Lager, Part 3. Another important trope in recent Polish prose about the Holocaust are places after Lager, functioning today in most cases as so-called cities of memory, museums that housed German Nazi concentration camps and other Holocaust sites which were de facto modern death factories. While not only Jews died in these facilities, they comprised the overwhelming majority of victims. For a number of Polish contemporary writers, such sites of memory constitute an important point of reference. Works in which places after Lager appear include Piotr Paziński's Boarding House, Marta Masadas Święto Trąbek, Feast of Trumpets, Magdalena Tullis Włoskie Szpilki, Italian High Hills and Szum, Noise, Monika Rakusas 39.9, Zyta Rudzkas Ślicznotka doktora Józefa, Dr. Józef's Cute, and Igor Ostachowicz's Night of the Living Jews. The artistic imagination of these authors exploit the image of railroad tracks, locomotives, trains, and boxcars as objects symbolizing the main method used to transport prisoners to their places of execution. These images have permanently entered the Polish Holocaust imaginarium. These tracks become the most visible form for reconstructing the memory of the Holocaust, leading to something old and something new, something that cannot yet be defined. In Pensionat, Boarding House, the plot of the novel itself centers around the railroad traction, metaphorically called the spine of the line, and a railroad station on the Warsaw-Lublin road, along which freight trains full of locked-up Jews traveled during the war. Boarding House likewise ends with an evocation of these tracks. Along them, the protagonist reaches the station late in the night. However, the key topos in Polish Holocaust prose written after 2000 is, of course, Auschwitz, a wordway symbol of the Holocaust itself, symbolically representing all sites of mass extermination of Jews. It is a fundamental trope in Masada's novel Feast of Trumpets, in which the main character, through belonging to the third generation after the Shoah, feels as if she spent her childhood in Auschwitz with a camp doll in her hand, due to the continuous retelling of traumatic stories by her grandfather, who raised her, a former camp prisoner. The narrator-heroine of Magdalena Tullis' novel Italian High Hills is similarly affected by the trauma of Holocaust. She shares her childhood experiences. For example, she recalls how her mother, a former concentration camp prisoner, woke up every half hour as if she was being roused again and again for roll call. The Holocaust thus pervades the reality of a daughter born after the war, placing her in the world of Holocaust and preventing her from living a normal life. In Rakusa's novel 39.9, Auschwitz is a cursed place that has a supernatural effect on the narrator-heroine, a young woman who belongs to the second generation after the Holocaust. In Zyta Rudzka's novel Dr. Józef's Cute, we can see a different kind of havoc in the psyche of a camp survivor. As a child, the main character was the victim of cruel experiments conducted by the Nazi Dr. Josef Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death, as well as experiencing other degrading situations. The mentioned novel, Night of the Living Jews by Ostachowicz, evocatively depicts the reality of German concentration camps through an extremely naturalistic vision that appears in the dramas of modern-day protagonists. The novel's further description of camp reality are an accurate reconstruction of mechanisms used to degrade the people at Auschwitz, to dehumanize them. The protagonist of contemporary Polish novel in which the Holocaust features prominently succumb to the effects of trauma in different ways. The Holocaust casts its shadow on my world, says the narrator of Rakusa's 39.9, while the heroine of Rudzka's novel paradoxically states, I would never have imagined it is possible. I miss the camp. The heroine of Feast of the Tramps by Masada, for example, offers the cursory association that Mickey Mouse was 12 years old when an extermination camp was established on the grounds of Auschwitz. Place after Aryan Side, Part 4. During the Holocaust, Nazi law divided occupied Polish cities and towns in the general government into two zones. The first zone was Jewish, labeled ghettos or closed districts. The inhabitants were, as a result of various policies, subjected to forced resettlement, deportation, execution, starvation, and disease. During the course of the war, these districts underwent a process of progressive change, always for the worse, until eventually the inhabitants were exterminated and they ceased to function. The second zone was Aryan, to use Nazi terminology. These areas were intended to be made free of Jews as quickly as possible. After the war, Poland became such an area in its eternity, firstly, due to the systematical physical annihilation of members of the Jewish community, and secondly, for many among the small percentage who survived resettlement and sometimes successful individual escapes from the hell of the Holocaust, and later, as a result of Aliyah, successive waves of Jewish emigration, the last of which was the so-called March Aliyah of 1968-1972. In recent Polish Holocaust literature, the Aryan side provides an important point of reference. This includes the works mentioned above, as well as such work as Bożena Kew's Utwór o Matce i Ojczyźnie, A Piece on Mother and the Fatherland, Mariusz Sieniewicz Żydówek nie obsługujemy, We Don't Serve Jewesses, and Piotr Szewc Zmierzchy i Poranki, Twillings and Mornings, and Bociany nad Powiatem, Storks Over the Country, the sequel to Zagłada Annihilation since 1987. In the textual world of Holocaust, victims and places after Aryan side, we find supersign spaces that seem completely unrelated to the memory of the Holocaust. Roma Sendyka has called them non-places of memory. Jews still exist in them just as they do it in places after ghetto, where they are supposedly killed but eternally alive. As Kev writes, in his grotesque portrayal, they have such power that they multiply death. They are literally everywhere, as Poles have built on their remains, and they bones many neighborhood, churches, housing estates, roadways, and parks. All of Warsaw, not just Muranów, as the author points out, stands on Jewish ashes. Another category of protagonists is post-2000 Polish Holocaust literature in Jews in Poland who still continue to live under the assumed Aryan identity despite the passing of more than half of century since the Holocaust, because they fear further persecution. This is shown in Rakusa's novel 39.9, where the main character's mother, who is a child of the Holocaust, gives her daughter, who accidentally discovers her Jewish roots, specific advice in regard to this fact. Among the rural communities of Podlasie depicted in Stanisław Gromadzki's Jewess, the stereotype of Jew is prevalent just as it is in Kev's work. According to the local peasant, even the current head of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Francis, and the pastor of the Roman Catholic parish are also Jews. Almost all the Polish bishops are Jews, as are many contemporary politicians. All those who, for various reasons, do not come to church on Sunday are also seen as almost certainly having something to do with Jewry. Piotr Szewc, on the other hand, treats the presence of Jews quite differently, referring to the issue of the Holocaust only metonymically and placing the plots of his novel in a pre-war Polish Jewish town, not yet affected by the Holocaust. In this novel, the Shoah is also symbolized by a forbidding sense of the end on an era, symbolized by a closing, the book of the day has been written. Conclusion, part 5. Thanks to narrative described above, recent Polish literature for adults has become a symbolic place after Jews, showing how non-Jews were also traumatized by the Holocaust. These texts allow one to grasp the significance of this catastrophe, not only for Jews, but also for Poles and humanity in general. They also show how the consequences of the Holocaust are still felt by people many decades after its historic end. Thus, it can be said that in the textual world, the Holocaust continues. Its victims, in line with the author's intentions, speak out, exposing their wants and refusing to go off into oblivion. Will this literature allow Poles to finally come to terms with this tragedy, to face their own myth of innocence and helplessness, and finally, will it help evoke an understanding of the need to collectively lament the loss of the former citizens of this country and allow for a national mourning? Undoubtedly, the rising tide of text about the Holocaust, most of them of high artistic merit, offer hopes that an axiological breakthrough may now be taking place before our very eyes. Thank you so much for your attention.
Hi, my name is Alexei Surin. I am research assistant and PhD candidate at the Bar-Ilan University, Israel. In my work, I explore Russian Jewish, Russian Israeli, and Holocaust literature. In the collection of texts in series Studies in Jewish History and Memory for Peter Lang Publishing House, I present the essay what I called Russian Language Literature of the Holocaust in 21st Century, Poetic and Narrative Strategies, in which I explore fiction about the Holocaust written in Russian during the last 2 decades, including novels of such writers like Elena Makarova, Margarita Hamlin, Lyudmila Ulitskaya, Boris Akunin, and others. In the 21st century, as in the second half of the 20th century, not much fiction has been written about the Holocaust in Russian language, especially in comparison with Holocaust literature in other European languages. Several factors contribute to this phenomenon. First among them is Soviet censorship. During the Soviet era, the depiction of the Holocaust was largely suppressed, hindering the development of a significant literary corpus. Official narrative prioritized the Soviet experience of World War II, minimizing the fate of Jewish victims. The second factor is what the traumatic memories of the Gulag and political repression, deeply embedded in Russian history, have overshadowed the Holocaust in the national consciousness. Even in the post-Soviet era, Russian authors have predominantly explored themes closer to Russian catastrophes, including the Bolshevik Revolution, the Civil War, the Second World War and the Siege of Leningrad, the collapse of USSR, and others. However, among Russian language writers of the 21st century, there are authors who write about the Holocaust and even make the Holocaust the main object of their literary study. Reading the text of these authors, we can see what they usually build their writing about the show around three poetic concepts: memory, knowledge, in connection with pedagogy, and time. In this regard, three narrative tragedies can be distinguished depending on which of these concepts becomes prevalent in text. The first tragedy can be called memorialization. This approach focuses on working with the memory, or post-memory in Mariana Hirsch terms, of the Shoah, seeking to capture these memories and utilize them as creative material for formulating, visualizing, and attempting to repair the devastation caused by the Holocaust. Among the authors who use this narrative tragedy is the writer Margarita Hamlin. Born and raised in Ukrainian towns Oster and Chernigiv, with a significant pre-war Jewish population, Hamlin sets her novels in this locus. Through her fiction, she constructs a literary universe of Oster, showcasing the lost world of the Jewish community. Her characters navigate love, marriage, betrayal, and, most importantly, survival amidst the persistent threats of hatred and violence, both during the Holocaust and the period of Stalin's repressions against the Jews. For Hamlin, it is essential not to show the Holocaust as an event beyond comprehension due to the horror and scale of killings, but to recreate concrete details of everyday Jewish life during this dark period. In her novel Guilty One, Крайний in Russian, there is an episode when American journalist filming a documentary about the Shoah and asked the protagonist, Nisal Zaydenband, what the Holocaust is. He answered, the Holocaust is when people killed without talking. However, a person needs a conversation. In this phrase, we can find the roots of Hamlin principles in her Holocaust writing. She aims to create a conversation to reveal the individuality of the person and their uniqueness in a process what Nazi criminals try to make as faceless as possible. Starting from small fragments of memory about the Jews killed in Oster, she reconstructs their world, thoughts, and experience, thereby expanding the memory about them and creating a kind of memory capsule containing their stories. Writer and poet Maria Stepanova offers the same attention to details of the lost world in her book In Memory of Memory, a half-novel, half-essay in which she explores the problem of the memory, including the memory of Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Stepanova acknowledges the risk of reducing individual narratives to mere emblems of collective suffering, stating, quote, any story of a victim becomes an arrow pointing to a common fate and common death. This, she argues, presents an ethical and epistemological dilemma as it obscures the individuality and uniqueness of each victim. Stepanova counters this by presenting Holocaust victims not just as historical witnesses, but as a, quote, first people on earth, end quote, empowered to sculpt themselves in the space of writer texts. In her writing, Stepanova refuses to follow grand narratives in lighter terms, but aims to create Noah's Ark, or like Hamlin, a memory capsule where, quote, the most insignificant figure is not completely lost. The second narrative strategy what I identify is pedocentrism. I borrowed this term from Boris Akunin, who uses it in his novel Trezorium, to emphasize the centrality of education and knowledge for human existence. This term, derived from two words, pedagogy and centrism, reflects a rational belief in individual human potential and the ethical imperative of acquiring knowledge and understanding. Within this framework, knowledge becomes a crucial tool for overcoming and preventing historical atrocities like the Holocaust. One of the central characters of Akunin Trezorium is Bahndirektor, a German teacher obsessed with the idea to create in Warsaw Ghetto a closed educational institution for children. According to his philosophy, the world is chaos, devoid of rationality and inhabited by embittered and unhappy people who destroy all living things as a result of their inability to find purpose in life. However, he believes that this chaos can be overcome with the help of proper education. Bahndirektor's pedagogical system is based on the idea that every child possesses a unique talent. The teacher's role is to identify and nurture this talent, enabling the child to excel in their chosen field. In his book, Akunin reimagines the Bildungsroman. While classic Bildungsroman celebrates the protagonist's discovery of social values, Akunin characters confront a nightmarish reality devoid of such values. In Holocaust literature, this ethical and epistemological disruption often leads to the breakdown of human subject as a rational and educable being. However, unlike Elie Wiesel's words, quote, at Auschwitz not only man died but also the idea of man, Akunin offers a counterpoint. Through Bahndirektor's Trezorium, a repository of human knowledge and education, Akunin portrays the enduring idea of man. Significantly, this utopian project arises within a Warsaw ghetto, where the Nazi machinery seeks to erase individuality. Education and knowledge thus become potent tools for Akunin, illustrating how mechanism of dehumanization can be undermined, leading to individual epistemological triumph in the face of catastrophe. Людмила Улицкая novel Daniel Stein Interpreter, Daniel Stein Переводчик, echoes Akunin's celebration of knowledge against the backdrop of the Holocaust. The book's main character is a Jew who survived the Shoah, saved many Jews from death, and converted to Christianity. As a pastor and teacher, Stein becomes an interpreter of knowledge and ethics for those around him. He rejects the idea of knowledge existing separately from morality, arguing that understanding the world carries inherent responsibility. In contrast to the Greek truth principle, what, as he declares, can destroy a man, Stein advocates human connection and empathy to the other and presents in the novel as a modern saint who finds salvation not in abstract truth, but in faith in the individual and their relationship with others. The third narrative strategy that I identify is time reframing. It is characterized by understanding of the Holocaust as an event so monstrous and falling out of history that describing it in terms of linear time is impossible for writers. Therefore, the time of the Holocaust with such a narrative organization is portrayed as a mythological time outside the bounds of linear progression. In novels of such discourse, the Shoah takes place in the eternal present and is looped with tragedies of nowadays. A writer, historian, and art therapist Yelena Makarova employs this tragedy in her novel Friedel. This novel chronicles the life of Friedel Dicker Brandeis, a German artist and educator who found solace and purpose in teaching drawing to children imprisoned within the Theresian ghetto. Portraying Friedel's life from childhood to deportation to the Theresian ghetto, the author shows the events of the artist's life as not subject to a linear order, but coexisting simultaneously. In the introduction to the novel, Makarova notes what linear time, the time of order, was discredited by the fact that the Nazis explained their participation in the final solution by maintaining order and fulfilling orders given to them by authorities. Hence, the author aims to break the linearity and orderliness of the narrative and present Friedel as a person who has left an indelible mark on existence that even death cannot erase. Thus, mythological time in the novel is born from a view of life on the one hand as an ever-flowing and never-freezing substance, and on the other as an unfinished art project, not constrained by the conventions of the time, whose incompleteness is a form of interaction with the present. The interaction with the present is the main theme of Alex Tarrant's novel Reina, Queen of Destiny, Reina, Королева Судьбы, in which young woman Reina and her boyfriend Nir try to save Reina's grandmother, who was raped and lost her children during the Holocaust in Ukraine. Reina believes that her life is mysteriously linked to her grandmother's life and that she can change her destiny by changing her own life. As a result, the novel describes an intense relationship between the past and the present, where history is not an accomplished fact but data open to change. In science fiction, the protagonist often travels to the past or future to change a tragic event and prevent it from occurring. Tarrant breaks this conventional trope. His characters stay in their own present to simultaneously change both the present and the past. This failed attempt at time travel disrupts the linear flow of time, leaving Nir and Reina with only present, in which the Holocaust and the reality of contemporary Israel exist. In this brief analysis, we have explored the three narrative strategies employed by Russian language writers in their literature on the Holocaust. The concept of memory in this literature appears not so much as a tool for studying the past, but for its restoration through narrative. Knowledge is associated with pedagogy and ethics in its confrontation with chaos. The time of history seems irrelevant and transformed into the time of myth, where the Holocaust becomes a cosmological event that continues to shape the world. Ultimately, all these three narrative strategies converge in a shared purpose: the desire to create a literary framework that reclaims life and essence from the clutches of death and oblivion. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Rga Heller. I'm a senior lecturer at K Academic College of Education in Be'er Sheva, Israel, and a member of the Comparative Holocaust Literature 21st Century International Research Team, and the author of the chapter about Israeli Holocaust literature at the beginning of the 21st century. My chapter focuses on contemporary Israeli fiction about the Holocaust, suggesting reading some of the recent but distinguished texts for adults, young adults, and children. It aims at exposing the fictive memories and testimonies about Israeli official memorization of the Holocaust and their part in constructing alternate national post-memories. The chapter studies the similar characteristics of Israeli fiction about the Holocaust, such as illness, horror, and testimonies, and the different characteristics that define text for children and young adults, such as forced happy endings and limited or blurred presentation of time during the Holocaust. Yet, the central aspect of the lion's share of the fictional text are their testimonial nature and the dominant motive of home as physical place and a metaphorical idea, including its no-home dichotomy as a leading topos. Holocaust and Holocaust literature are inherent parts of the Israeli culture and national memory, although Holocaust is a part of World War II, a post-Old War. It continues to be a vital and influential shaping force of national identity and the new collective traumas within Israeli society, and therefore an effective arena for new literary and artistic works. The blur between the collective Holocaust drama and the personal Holocaust drama is part of the Israeli identity at the beginning of the 21st century. For example, the new reality post-October 7th, 2023, when the Hamas brutal mega-terror attack on the kibbutzim in the south of Israel, in which new survivors' testimonies echo old ones, ask for a new definition of Holocaust fiction, and atrocity. Taking the study of contemporary Holocaust literature into this social debate. Embracing a comparative aspect, my chapter looks for similarities in novels, young adult texts, and picture books for children. I argue that the acceleration of time changes the past relations between fiction and documentary or story within Israeli literature about the Holocaust, but that these changes themselves are quite different in text for adults, young adults, and children. I analyze and compare the text common themes and motives and discuss the representations of post-memories. Special attention is given to the questions of the aspects of monstrosities, to the 100 allegedly inherited dramas, and the status of Holocaust survivors and their testimonies as vessels of memories in the 21st century's Israel. For Jewish people in Israel, the Holocaust is still, in its way, a present history, since for the young modern state of Israel, it was a main accelerator of its foundation and still preceptor. Hence, contemporary Hebrew writing about the Holocaust is always a sort of ontological quest, artistic research for an alternate explanation and other ways of commemorization. By reconfronting the monstrosity, 21st century writers confront their past and present. They build a personal narrative that most often challenges the collective memory or contradicts conceptions and taboos by suggesting the existence of an alternate truth. The alternate stories or the alternate truths about the Holocaust lead to literary ontological quests. This quest echo Holocaust fictional testimonies and allegedly family memories through encountering different degrees of monstrosity. In the lion's share of the New Hebrew text, monstrous memories and adopted painful memories harm the protagonist and make them physically and mentally ill. The protagonist's obsession with the past and the Holocaust hold them in a mental scheme of exile Jewish past, an antonym for the Israeli ideal of an Israeli-born, healthy and powerful generation, the Sabres, Tzabarim, hence the protagonist of the new Israeli novel about the Holocaust, are often presented as Holocaust survivors, even though they were born after World War II was over. And as such, they are post-traumatic living ghosts. As ghosts, they take upon themselves the mission of carrying the Holocaust memory and transferring it through their actions and their testimonies. Yet their exaggerated and possessed behavior is not measured through quantity, but by literary quality and the author's ability to persuade the readers of his or her survivor's truth. In recent years, the never-ending research for truth reaches its highest in the fictional testimonies in contemporary Hebrew children's stories. Creating a fictional story after biographical research is common to Israeli Holocaust literature at the beginning of the 21st century. The fact that the text is based upon a true story put in the front and becomes a central feature of the text. With exact names, locations, and photos, the fictional story receives historical qualities. And that happens also in children's literature. In my chapter, I also demonstrate by analyzing a few texts how the first decades of the 21st century mark a shift in the field of Holocaust fictional biographies for children in Israel. For the first time, a distinguished number of biographical picture books about the Holocaust are published year after year in different publishing houses. These texts include an appendix with biographical notes, photographs, and other documentary materials without a direct verbal reference to the Holocaust in their main story. Even without reading the appendix, the Holocaust context is clear because in Israel, the Holocaust visual symbols, such as the yellow badges and the spirit closers, or the death camps wires, are common knowledge, even for kids, in most of the texts. Thanks to the illustrators, or there are various visual references that they build an opposite image of the Hebrew Holocaust literature as written as written for adults, therefore, I'm also interested in examining the characteristics of contemporary Israeli young adults literature about the Holocaust from various perspectives: literary, historical, and educational. Considering this current discussion, as you may read in my chapter. Yet, as I mentioned before, the topos, home, with its opposite, no home, such as in national home, homeland, and one family home, are also central features of the search for a new definition and new contents of Holocaust literature and Holocaust fiction, which leads contemporary Israeli Holocaust authors fiction as different genre. And the most important change, considering contemporary Israeli fictional text about the Holocaust, as I see it, is the existence of a fictional narrative about the Holocaust without tagging the text under Holocaust fiction. So contemporary Holocaust fiction written in Hebrew may be at the beginning of a change in which the central aim of the current generation of Holocaust authors is to offer the readers new voices about the Holocaust. The new voices may be new fictional testimonies, such as the silent traumas of the Mizrahi Jews, or about the mental suffering that affects the next generation, the second generation, the third generation, but above all, the new voices are Israeli voices, and they tell an Israeli story, whether writing for adults, young adults, or young children. Even Israeli representations badges the old diaspora wounds, therefore metaphorically transporting the Holocaust into the modern state of Israel, or as a second-generation Israeli author, as Esti Gimel Chaim puts this idea in her Doppelganger words, there is no escape from this old traumatic past. And Israeli contemporary writers keep publishing present-day stories which have a dark secret connected to the Holocaust. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Paul Miller-Melamed, and I'll be reading the text Between Denial and Accountability. Hi, my name is Paul Miller-Melamed, and I'll be reading Germany tell about the Denial and Accountability, what and the Holocaust does Unified Germany tell about the Third Reich of Tel Aviv University, who unfortunately was unable to record Tel Aviv University herself, who unfortunately was unable to record the content of this article that I'll be reading does not reflect my own content views necessarily. Article that I'll be reading does not reflect my own specifically views necessarily. Professor Shavit. This is the work specifically, and only this is the story that West Germany told its children and young adults about its past in hundreds. This is the story that West Germany told its children and young adults about its past in hundreds of historical novels. Hitler and a small group of Nazis under his command managed to take over the country and force it into a state of belligerence and war. The Germans take over the country and force it into a state of belligerence and war. Nazis, the Germans didn't want this war at all, who were not real Germans. Of Nazis, that was responsible under Hitler's leadership real Germans. This terrible war upon that Germany. Was responsible under the Hitler's war was indeed terrible, causing this terrible suffering to the people, exposing them to hunger, homelessness. The war was indeed terrible, causing dreadful suffering to the Jews in Germany, exposing them to hunger, homelessness, deportation, and death. Sometimes they were Jews in Germany suffered as well, on occasion concentration camps, where at times they they were sent to prison. Yet only in the rare occasion concentration camps where they murdered the real victim of Hitler's crimes. In the rarest cases, people, the Germans themselves, the real victim had no hand in the suffering inflicted on the Jews. The Germans themselves had no hand in the suffering inflicted on the Jews. Indeed, the Germans loved the Jews and very often helped to save them from the wicked villainous Hitler. The Germans loved the Jews and very often helped to save them from the wicked villainous Hitler by deceiving the entire who successfully carried out his devious plans. After he returned, by deceiving the entire German havoc upon after he the returned Germans, Hitler's disappearance enabled the German nation to return to its the Germans Hitler's disappearance enabled its pre-1933 to return to its true state as punishment for Hitler's crimes. The Allies subjected the Germans to much suffering. The Allies punishment for Hitler's crimes. The Allies subjected the Germans to much suffering. They bombed German cities for 3 consecutive years without rhyme or reason, destroying for the sake of cities for 3 consecutive years. Later they divided Germany, separating families, destroying for the sake of destruction and anguish. Later they divided Germany, separating families, and causing poverty and anguish. End of the story. More than 40 years ago, in 1987, I first presented my thesis on the story. More than 40 years ago, in 1987, I first presented my thesis on the story. I argued that German authors, despite their good intentions, constructed a story. I argued that German authors, despite their good intentions, constructed a story. A close reading of denial and rejection of accountability for children. My analysis was based on a close reading of dozens of West German historical novels for children and teens that I presented in a small book published together with Kinder und Malta Darendorf, die Darstellung des published by Deepa Verlag in Kinder und Jugend. My examination led me to a shocking published by Deepa Verlag in 1988. German responsibility. My examination led me to a shocking conclusion. The books deny German responsibility for the atrocities and war crimes of World War II. In addition, the allegation against the Allies intensified by the story of victimhood. In addition, the allegation against the Allies intensified by the mass German populations were part of an attempt to relativize the atrocities committed by the German populations. Were part of an attempt to relativize the atrocities committed by the Germans during World War II. Time span and protagonists. Story German protagonists predetermined victims of Nazism and protagonists. Its arena was largely German protagonists and its time frame extended from the pre-war period to the immediate aftermath. The East and its time frame extended from the pre-war period to the immediate handling of the past in German children's literature was not part of a revisionist effort this handling to deny the reality of German children's literature was not rather part of an attempt to offer to deny the reality of the Third Reich. That best suited the general self-righteous German historical discourse that best suited the initial findings of my study caused outrage among colleagues, as well as in the German press. The initial findings of my study caused outrage among colleagues on the grounds that as well as in the German press. My study was attacked from various angles. But the more comprehensive study published later in my Hebrew and English books, and these studies are a past study published later in my Hebrew and English for children, and these studies are a past without shadow, constructing the past, which encompass no less than 345 books, produce results even more shocking, which encompass no less than 345 books, produce results even more shocking, no matter who their writers were or when they were published. That unmakes the Holocaust, after Germany's reunification or the rise of the post-Wende generation. However, my study was received with less hostility. Meanwhile, I will show the story itself began to change, at least partially, and a new discourse of accountability itself began to change, at least partially. And a new discourse of accountability and responsibility began to evolve. I now argue that the new story, which began to emerge, did give expression to the dark side of history. Story, at the same time, did give expression to the dark side of history. Did not disappear altogether after the reunification. In fact, it was even did not disappear altogether after the reunification. Of a succession of television movies, documentaries, novels, and children's books, a succession of television movies, documentaries, novels, and children's books, which I will Before examining the story itself, I would like to say a very few words about the writers. Before examining the story itself, I would like to say a very few words about the writers of the book. In post-war West Germany, among them are several of about 30 years that are distinguished by the author's unique literary and among them are several award-winning books. Their authors such as Christine Nusslinger and Peter Hertling. Rank among the most prominent and celebrated children's authors in the German-speaking countries. Rank among the most prominent and celebrated children's authors. Some authors have written only a single work. Others have written many. There are male and female authors have written only a single work. Others have written many. There are male and female authors. Their biographies span wide personal differences. Some experienced World War II. Their biographies span wide personal differences. Some authors served in the armed forces during the war or have others were born after them, other relatives. Some authors served in the armed forces during the war, the authors nevertheless share a similar historical consciousness. Despite this diversity, the authors nevertheless share a similar historical consciousness or perception based on which the very same story is repeatedly related by authors of different backgrounds. How can we account for the similarity of the story and could not possibly have had different backgrounds, the same life experience, different generations? I argue that the uniformity of the story stems from the circumstances of its birth. I argue that the story doesn't derive from the author's own life experiences of its birth, but rests on a pre-existing model that guides the author's own life experiences, historical material, but rests on a pre-existing model that guides the handling to make their story feel real is part of an attempt to lend credibility to make their story feel real is part of an attempt to lend credibility historical memory that characterizes not only books for children, but this handling of the historical material characterizes not only literature for children, but numerous texts such as documentaries, the historical novels for children and teens written in West Germany after 1945 did not arise in a vacuum. For children and teens written in West Germany after 1945 did not arise in a vacuum that would best suit the needs of the present. They were part of an integral effort story that highlights the German suffering while displaying the Nazis as the authors tell a story that highlights the German suffering while displaying the Nazis as the sole perpetrators. The story establishes the Nazis' liability by creating a fictitious dichotomy between Germans and Nazis. The Nazis' liability by creating a fictitious dichotomy between Germans and Nazis. According to the story, the Nazis rose to power in Germany as a foreign force. According to the story, the Nazis rose to power in Germany. They did not arise out of German society or because of its deeds. They did not arise out of part of the strategy of denying guilt and disclaiming any German responsibility. The dichotomy is part of a strategy of denying guilt and disclaiming any German responsibility for the crimes of World War II. An unintended consequence of this dichotomy is the creation of similarity between the Nazis and another consequence of this dichotomy is the creation of similarity between the Nazis and another group traditionally described in the German repertoire as the other. Horrendous and startling as it may seem, this similarity apparently unintended and startling as it may seem, this similarity apparently in the models of the German literary repertoire has a logic of its own. Described as in the models of the German literary repertoire, Jews were traditionally described as the Nazis. The two groups, Jews and Nazis, exhibit physical similarities and share many other features such as their ceremonies, their control over Germans, physical similarities and share many other features such as their ceremonies, their control over Germans as having exceptional abilities. In addition, a priori advantage over Germans as having exceptional abilities and an all-embracing and present in all spheres of life. The social advantage is absolute, all-embracing and present in all spheres of life. This seemingly positive philo-Semitic portrayal of Jews transmutes into anti-Semitic sentiment. Positive philo-Semitic portrayal of Jews transmutes into anti-Semitic sentiments. Who are unable to meet the challenge. Is perceived as an unfair advantage in the text Germans the following. Who are unable to meet the Germans to compete with the message latent in the text Nazism indirectly helped them difficult for the Germans to compete with the Jews. Usually and Nazism indirectly helped rather than close the gap. And their ability to cause harm even as refugees or prisoners as menacing rather than mythicized. And their ability to cause harm even as refugees or prisoners is mythicized. Are present. The recurrent message is that trouble is to be found wherever Jews non-German readers present. Confronted with this German story wonder at the disappearance non-German readers confronted with this German story wonder at the disappearance of the Nazi persecution of the Jews and the labor minorities, the death camps, and are bound to ask where are the Gestapo, the torture of defenseless children, the murder of privation and terror of the Gestapo, the torture, the suffering, and the vicious genocide, the privation and ruin, the tens of millions of Europeans Europeans, the suffering and the vicious genocide of terror and the systematic millions of European Jewish people, the brutal reign of terror and the systematic murder of the Jewish people. They are all absent from the story. Minorities. The German story focuses on German suffering, which is highlighted and described in great detail. The German story focuses on German suffering, which is highlighted and described in great detail. Everything else is shunted aside or totally removed. Like any other narrative of the past, the German narrative is built on a tension between remembering and forgetting. Like any other narrative of the past, the German narrative is built on a tension between remembering and forgetting, and on the deliberate selection and deletion of events, the recollection motivated by the wish to preserve a more agreeable memory. Friedlander's terms, the recollection of society addressed its past, not by working it Friedlander's terms, but by acting German society addressed its past, not by a general denial of the Nazi past, but by acting German discussion moved to from silence and a general denial of the Nazi past. German historiographical writing that endeavors to normalize the past. End quote. Part historiographical writing that endeavors, according to normalize the story, the Nazis took over Germany against the will of the Germans. According to the story, the Nazis took over Germany against the will of the Germans. Victims, who which has been evolving since the early days of the Federal Republic. The Germans is rooted, as already mentioned, in the fictitious distinction between Germans and Nazis. Is rooted, as already mentioned, is portrayed as a non-German figure Germans who is different from the Germans. Hitler himself is portrayed as a non-German figure who is different from the Germans both physically and mentally. The story of German victimhood in the First and Second World Wars was not born recently after the reunification of Germany, but immediately after the end of World War II. After the reunification of Germany, but immediately after the end of World War II. The story of the rejection of guilt that emerged in the early 1960s. The story of the rejection of guilt that emerged in the early 1960s. This story has become a constituting framework for the German historical discourse. Has become a kind of constituting framework for the German historical discourse. As mentioned, according to this story, the Nazis took over Germany against the will of the Germans. As mentioned, according to this story, the Nazis took over Germany against the will of the Germans. The Germans were the victims of Nazism. As a non-German demonic figure, nevertheless, pre-Venda portrayal of Hitler as a non-German demonic figure who is to be blamed for all the horrors of World War II. In this era, not only the Germans are perceived change during the post-Venda era. The Nazis themselves are not only the Germans are perceived as victims of Nazism, and even Hitler is perceived as a victim of Hitler and Nazism. And even Hitler victimhood is the main organizing principle of the story and a multitude of post-Venda texts. Victimhood is the main organizing principle of the story and a multitude of post-Venda reunification, including documentaries. Among them are Downfall, 2004, after the reunification, The Final Days, 2005. Conspicuous among them are Downfall, 2004, truly is truth about Adolf Hitler, 2007. And My Fuhrer, I would like to turn now to a short discussion about Adolf Hitler, 2007. Because to my mind, I would like to turn now to a short manifestation of my forgiving and lenient because to my mind it is the most extreme manifestation of the forgiving and lenient approach towards Nazism. My Fuhrer was produced by the Swiss-German Jewish director Danny Levy in 2007. My Fuhrer was produced by the Swiss-German Jewish director Danny Levy in 2007. Hitler as a satire on Nazism. A Jewish actor and drama professor who was Hitler by Joseph Goebbels from the Saxon concentration camp professor in an attempt to revive the feelings of the other Adolf and help him recapture his joy of leadership, to revive the feelings of the other Adolf and help him recapture his joy of leadership and his talent needed for Grunbaum services because he, the Jew, is the only one who can revitalize the Fuhrer needed Grunbaum services because he, the Jew, is the only one who can revitalize the Fuhrer and save creature who comes to life with the Jews' assistance. Hitler of My Fuhrer is presented as a pathetic creature who comes to life. How does the film manage to evoke sympathy for Hitler and compassion? I contend that the sympathetic attitude towards Hitler results primarily from Levy's Levy's decision to address that the sympathetic attitude towards Hitler results primarily from Levy's decision which are only hinted at in the psychology. Levy portrays Hitler as a battered child with only hinted at father whose desire to exterminate the Jews as a battered child with an abusive father whose desire to exterminate the Jews. We see him as loved by dogs, a childhood for love who desperately seeks warmth. In scene after scene, we see him as loved by dogs into the bed of the Jewish love who desperately seeks warmth. Hitler is a boyish imp who plays with battleships in his bubble bath to make up for childhood experiences he never had. With battleships in his bubble bath to make up for childhood experiences he never had. The connection between Hitler and the catastrophe that is taking place around him. This is visualized between Hitler and the catastrophe that is taking place around him. This is visualized in a scene in which the officers before his scheduled visit to the city, they ordered the facades of the houses to be rebuilt in order to shield him from scheduled visit to the city. They ordered the facades of the houses to be rebuilt in order to shield him from discovering not only is Hitler responsible for the devastation of Berlin. In other words, but he doesn't even know. Not only is Hitler responsible in the final scene of the movie, Hitler loses his voice and is unable to address the audience that fills the square. In the final scene of the movie, Hitler gives the hearty motivational speech to the audience that fills the square. Who can give the hearty motivational speech in his stead? Suggested that Adolf the German and Adolf the Jew are interchangeable. A resemblance that suggested that Adolf the German and Adolf the Jew are interchangeable. Charlie Chaplin's immortal film The Great Dictator, which debuted in 1940, is of course in the background. Charlie Chaplin's immortal film The Great Dictator, which debuted in 1940, is of course in the background. Scene in which Chaplin steps out of the movie into real life. The climax of The Great Dictator is the scene in which Chaplin steps out of the movie into real life. Cannot be missed. From cinema, from here onward, it's not a game. The message to the viewers cannot be missed, and it is dangerous. From here onward, it's not a game. Danny Levy perhaps meant for this scene to evoke Chaplin's iconic scene, but the result is Danny Levy perhaps meant for this scene to evoke Chaplin's iconic it's all a game. But the result Hitler is no more than an actor in a psychological Levy tells drama, his viewers, the person who teaches him the fine art of Hitler acting is no more than an actor in a psychological drama. Adolf person who teaches him the fine art of acting. In contrast to the Great Dictator, Adolf Grunbaum does not step out of the movie. He hides under Hitler's podium. To the Great Dictator, Adolf Grunbaum the role of Hitler out of the with movie. Great fervor. He hides under Hitler's podium, and only at the end of the scene does he deviate from the written text and say a few words against Only at the end of the scene, although he never manages to finish what he begins to say a few words against Nazism. Levy's film adds another layer, particularly extreme to the established story. Levy's film adds another layer, particularly extreme to the story that the Germans have chosen to tell themselves about the Third Reich and the Holocaust, takes the story that the Germans have chosen to tell themselves and more barefaced and the Holocaust, and condenses it into something even cruder. Like many other works that found favor with German audiences, it created the impression of genuinely engaging with Nazism. Like many other works that found favor with German audiences, it created the impression of genuinely engaging with Nazism in the Nazi era, when in fact it does not even intolerant handling of Nazism. Its box office success indicates legitimacy by German movie-tolerant handling of Nazism. I must admit that, while pleasing the viewers, by German sparked a heated debate. Though I must admit that, while pleasing the viewers, the film sparked a heated debate. As already mentioned, the post-unification era saw not only the enhancement of the pre-Venda conspicuous manifestation was the use of the emergence of a new square as an arena. Its most conspicuous manifestation was the use of the some of these projects are highly visible, such as the Day commemoration projects. Some of these projects are highly visible, such as the Day book burning memorial at Babelplatz, or the Platform 17 memorial at Grunewald Station. Other projects are more modest, perhaps more emotionally effective, such as the Stolpersteiner, perhaps more emotionally effective, and the street sign project in Berlin's Bavarian Quarter. Project. Let me briefly describe the project in Berlin's Bavarian Quarter. The Stolpersteiner, let me briefly describe the project involves 10-centimeter concrete blocks or stumbling stones project involves 10-centimeter concrete blocks. Each is inscribed with the name of a victim of Nazi extermination or persecution who lived each is inscribed with the name of a victim of Nazi extermination or persecution who lived close and death. Along with the name of the project implies, they are meant to metaphorically trip up as the name of the project implies, and draw their attention. They are meant to metaphorically trip they demand active participation and draw their attention to the memorial who must perform they demand active participation on part of the passerby and a cognitive who must perform reading and digesting the bending over. And the cognitive here vonta, reading here and digesting the remind the passerby that the victims lived and worked here vonta, right here lived in a particular remind place, the passerby that the victims lived and worked right here, thus turning in a particular place historical and information into something concrete. Thus turning the abstract historical information tell the stories of the people who once lived there and resurrect the Jewish daily life in a most tell the stories of the people who once lived there. The idea behind the Street Signs Project is to vividly illustrate the steadily worsening conditions of Jewish life. The idea behind the Street Signs Project is to vividly illustrate the steadily worsening conditions of Jewish life scattered throughout Berlin's Bavarian quarter. The project involves 80 signs on one side throughout Berlin's Bavarian quarter against the Jews, and on the other side, each sign bears on one side a law or decree against the signs are relevant to their location. A pictorial representation of children's playground reads, the signs are relevant to their location and non-Aryan children to play together. Playground reads, quote, it is forbidden for Aryan and non-Aryan children at the Bayerischer Plot 38. Jews may only use the another sign near the green at the Bayerischer Plot reads, Jews may only use the Bayerischer Plot's benches. On the other side of the sign is an image of a bench. A third sign bears a picture of a cat. On the other side of the sign is an image of a decree forbidding Jews to keep pets. The third sign bears a picture of a cat. The aim of the project was to make tangible the gradual process of legislation. The aim of the project was to make tangible the gradual process of legislation, which after several years of regulations and laws unbearable and eventually led to their deportation, which after several years made the life of Jews unbearable. The signs not only educate passersby about the history of Berlin, more signs not only educate passersby into the present about the history of Berlin, more importantly, they embed the past memory of the present life and the developing memory create an intertext between people walking along the streets gather information developing memory the next and are gradually able to picture people walking along the streets gather information from one side to the next render the memory of the Holocaust alive and concrete and remind the passerby that render the memory of the Holocaust alive and concrete and remind the memorial projects I just described indicate that a change has indeed begun to take place. The memorial projects I just described indicate that a change Germany is certainly changing. However, let me emphasize about the past that the previous story described at the beginning of the article has let me emphasize and is not only story described at the beginning of the article has not gone away. If I wish to play the devil's advocate, but I may well ask, why not leave the old story alone? If I wish to play the devil's advocate, I may well ask, why not leave the old story alone? From any other? One may argue that German authors, like authors of any other nationality, have the right to present their own German authors, like authors of any other nationality, and wish have the right to present their own point of view. In the present era, which acknowledges the existence of multiple narratives, and endorses the idea that everyone has his or her own narrative story, and endorses the idea that everyone has his or her however people choose to tell it. Why not accept the German story? It is commonly argued that the dark chapters of the Third Reich are particularly difficult for young people to digest. It is commonly argued that the dark chapters of the Third Reich are particularly difficult or that any society would seek to protect its youngsters and that they should be spared this ordeal, or that any society would seek to protect by their youngsters from terrible aspects of its history. They will have plenty of opportunities to confront it when they grow up, the argument goes. They will have plenty of opportunities children's books in general and historical novels in particular. Accordingly, it is often said that children's books in general and should expose children to the more positive, describe the brighter side of life, and present should expose children to the mostly positive events of the Third Reich, of their Jewish neighbors, and peopled by mostly more Germans. Young readers should be presented with positive protagonists and role models. Moreover, to help young readers should be presented with positive protagonists. The naive assumption that children will believe a story that adults know to be false deserves a separate discussion. The naive assumption that children will believe a story that adults know to be false deserves a separate German texts for children do not hesitate. In this context, I would like to note that, readers generally speaking, German texts for children do not hesitate to expose the German children's literature repeatedly confronts children with very detailed and cool descriptions of human suffering. German children's literature repeatedly confronts children with very detailed and cool descriptions of human suffering, including in most cases these descriptions relate to German suffering and to German suffering alone. In most cases, these descriptions relate to German suffering and to German suffering. It is only descriptions of suffering. It is not descriptions of suffering that the children are spared. What pedagogical and psychological results can be expected if children grow up to discover that what pedagogical and psychological results can be expected if children grow up to discover? Furthermore, what kind of moral can children draw from a story that presents a world of well-intentioned? Furthermore, what kind of moral can children draw from a story that presents a world of well-intentioned people and decent citizens? Will they inadvertently understand that against an unbeatable demon? People struggle against will they inadvertently understand that most of the Germans were trying to help people struggle against persecuted communities? If most of the Germans were trying to help the Jews and the other persecuted why were their communities? As the texts for children seem to imply. Is this what the children are supposed to learn? Would it not be better to teach them a different lesson? Is this what the children are supposed to learn? Would it not be better to teach them a different lesson? That if more Germans had been willing to oppose dictatorship and who is really being protected here? Is it the children or the adults? History might have been different. Answer who is really being protected here? Is it the children or the adults? The case of the Third Reich and the Holocaust is not their children, just another case of distorted story. The case of the Third Reich and the Holocaust is why its legitimacy just another case of distorted story. Even this that is precisely why its legitimacy can and should be questioned. Even if this story was created unintentionally, it is the end result that matters. And even the end result is story was created unintentionally. West Germany and the United Germany chose to relate to the present and future generations both West Germany and the United Germany chose to relate to the distorted and future generations about the Third Reich and the Holocaust. This story is not only distorted and deformed, it is an immoral story as well.
When Israeli scholar Zohar Shavit first voiced her misgivings about German children's literature on the Holocaust, she caused quite a stir. Her findings, as later published in English in her study A Past Without Shadow, remain the strongest criticism of German children's and young adult literature on the Holocaust to date. In A Past Without Shadow, Shavit argues that German Holocaust fiction, even though it denounced all forms of Nazism, totalitarianism, and the persecution and murder of millions of European Jews and other groups, still worked to shift the blame for National Socialism, World War II, and the Shoah away from Germans. And she outlined a number of narrative strategies that contributed to the story about the Germans as victims of National Socialism. Almost a quarter of a century has passed since Shavit's harsh assessment, which begs the question whether her charges still ring true when assessing Holocaust literature published in 21st century Germany. One of Shavit's most serious charges is the one pertaining to the self-image of Germans as the true victims of World War II and ultimately even the Holocaust itself. However, since the 1990s, scholars have repeatedly taken to task those books that were felt to represent a problematic discourse of blame-shifting and self-victimization. In 2012, Rüdiger Steinlein found that the majority of novels dealing with the Shoah are told from the perspective of the victims. with regard to novels dealing with the German experience, he stresses that recent publications do no longer tell a story of German victimhood, but rather one of reconciliation, friendship, or even romance. However, the notion of German victimhood can play a problematic role in novels focusing on the displacement of Germans at the end of the Second World War, as a look at Gudrun Pausewang's novel Überleben, published in English as Dark Hours, will show. The novel is told from the perspective of 15-year-old Gisela, or Gisel, who has to flee from her hometown in Silesia when the Russian army approaches. After being separated from her mother and grandmother, Gisela and her siblings are trapped under a collapsed bomb shelter, and the novel centers around their desperate fight for survival. Remarkably, the narrator Gisela, who has spent virtually her entire life under National Socialist rule, has somehow managed to remain untouched by the anti-Semitic and racist ideology of the regime. In fact, there is no single reference to Jews at all. Perhaps even more problematic, the novel ends with an ambiguous statement about the evils of war, which is strongly revised in the English translation. In sum, the story of Gisela's survival reads like a tale that purposefully leaves out the deaths of those millions who are not mentioned once in Gisela's story. In Dark Hours, the Shoah has become invisible. While Pausewang's work may point to an older and certainly more problematic tradition of German children's literature, recent developments in the discourse on the Holocaust and multidirectional memory actually serve to broaden the narrative in the literary depiction of the Holocaust. Thus, in the last 20 years, several authors writing about the Holocaust have addressed topics that had not been prominent in German children's literature. Among these are several books dealing with the fate of Romani people and other groups such as the Yenish people. Together, these publications point to the gradual emergence of a diversified image of persecuted groups in German youth literature on the Holocaust. Another notable change in the literary discourse on the Shoah is the inclusion of the topics of the Kindertransport and the Shanghai exile. Even though both had been covered in adult literature before, as well as in translations for children and young adults, authors writing in German have only recently begun to deal with these subjects. In addition to that, novels written by Jewish writers in German have addressed topics such as the difficult relationship between Jews and Germans in post-war Germany and the German so-called Vergangenheitsbewältigung. After having looked at general trends in the development of German youth literature on the Holocaust, I will now focus on 3 case studies. I will briefly touch on the topics of the first 2 before giving you a more detailed account of the third book, Pei-Yu Chang's picture book, Mr. Benjamin's Suitcase of Secrets. David Zafir's novel 28 Days tells an adventurous story set during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from the perspective of a teenage girl named Mira. As my analysis shows, the novel strongly focuses on the redeeming value of resistance that transforms the ghetto inmates into proud Jews. Furthermore, the text also employs a number of narrative strategies that position the protagonist Mira as the object of male desire and potential violence. The character of Mira is thus strongly sexualized in a way that recalls the trope of the belle juive or beautiful Jewess from earlier texts. As Dean Ruritzka observes, covering the Holocaust's complexity means examining the causes, experiences, and also the aftermath of Nazi Germany and World War II. Reinhard Kleist's graphic novel does so in a visually striking and compellingly ambiguous way. The Boxer tells the story of the Holocaust survivor Herzko Haft and is based on the biography written by his son Alan Haft. At Auschwitz, Herzko Haft was forced to box other inmates in order to survive. After his liberation, he sought a career in professional boxing. In his last fight, he fought and lost against Rocky Marciano. While the biography devotes a lot of space to Haft's short-lived boxing career, placing the fight against Marciano as pivotal scene, Kleist's graphic novel focuses on Haft's survival during the Holocaust. In addition, the relationship between Herzko Haft and his son becomes a central element of the story, reflecting on the dynamics of intergenerational trauma and violence, biographical truth, and bearing witness in the post-memory era. Pei-Yu Chang's 2017 picture book takes up the event of Walter Benjamin's attempt to flee from his French exile to Spain, from where he planned to move on to Portugal and ultimately the United States. The group of refugees managed to cross the border but were denied entrance into Spain. Faced with the prospect of deportation, Benjamin committed suicide in his hotel room. The details about his death remain unclear to this day, and the suitcase with its contents could not be retrieved. Pei-Yu Chang takes up the mystery of Walter Benjamin's suitcase and tells his story in the form of an allegorical tale for children aged 6 and upwards. As a means of age adaptation, the author changes Benjamin's suicide into a mysterious disappearance. She also universalizes Benjamin's personal story so it becomes a metaphor for the dangers of totalitarianism. Here, Walter Benjamin is persecuted for his, quote, extraordinary ideas. Clearly, this wording highlights Benjamin's persecution as an intellectual, but not as a Jew. Looking at the illustrations, it also becomes clear that in this situation, everyone is in danger. The civilians are defenseless against the soldiers. In the German text, the readers are also told that when Benjamin finally decided to leave, all streets were closed, suggesting a kind of inaction on the part of the victim. This phrase comes uncomfortably close to the kind of blame-shifting Shavit describes. From this perspective, Chang might be accused of telling a story about National Socialism with no death, no Jews, and ultimately no Holocaust. However, I shall argue that this reading does not do justice to the complexity of Chang's work. For the illustrations in Mr. Benjamin, Pei-Yu Chang uses colorized pencil drawings and fragments of Benjamin's writing and other cutouts. The technique of the collage might be read as a reference to the philosophical and literary concept of the montage that Benjamin developed in his writing. It is also very similar to the one used by Adam Jaromir and Gabriela Cichowska in Miss Esther's Last Performance, that tells readers about the last days of the orphanage led by Janusz Korczak in the Warsaw Ghetto. Both picture books represent the legacy of an author who perished in the Holocaust as an assemblage of text scraps and other bits and pieces. And even though both Korczak and Benjamin left a large body of writing, these literary legacies can be seen as unfulfilled, incomplete. Likewise, even though the picture books tell a coherent story, part of it remain inconclusive, baffling to the reader. And here the metaphor of the suitcase and its mysterious content comes full circle. When Mr. Benjamin is asked by Melisa Fitko to leave his suitcase behind, his answer is, "I can't. What is in the suitcase could change everything. To me, this is the most important thing, more precious than my own life." Recalling Mr. Benjamin's answer, the end papers as well as the method of the collage reminds readers that what is missing might be the most important thing of all. Obviously, the central metaphor Chang's picture book is the suitcase of Walter Benjamin. However, this image is later linked with that of the magician, which is represented by the tall hat Mr. Benjamin wears, and which gains more prominence throughout the book. At the end of the book, there are 3 short biographical notes on Benjamin, Lisa Fitko, and the author herself. The page dedicated to Benjamin reveals that the idea of him as a wizard with a tall hat is in fact adapted from a quote from Theodor Adorno. If read as a metaphor, the disappearance of both the suitcase and its owner must certainly be seen as a means of addressing Walter Benjamin's suicide and the loss of his suitcase and all it could possibly contain. However, His disappearance and the elusive, perhaps even empty suitcase could also be read as the magician's last great trick, thereby outwitting his persecutors. Chang's picture book stands at the uneasy intersection between a retrieved narrative of blame-shifting, the possibilities and pitfalls of universalizing, and the creative potential of the medium in visualizing the irretrievable loss and fragmentation of memory caused by the Shoah. In this way, it might be read as representative of current developments in children's and young adult literature on the Shoah in Germany.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Minslow from California State University, Los Angeles, and I'm going to discuss my chapter on Anglophone children's literature and Holocaust education. This chapter focuses on 21st century Holocaust literature intended for audiences ages 18 or younger that was originally published in English. Although there are more than 800 books about the Holocaust that have been published in the United States and Canada since 2000, I have selected some that exemplify trends and tropes of 21st century children's and young adult Holocaust literature, including those that highlight experimental modes of storytelling and storytelling by non-related authors. After discussing the Holocaust education developments and Holocaust education in literature courses, I will explain some of the contemporary trends and tropes. So Holocaust education really came underway in the Anglophone world in the 1990s. So the United Kingdom was the first to implement Holocaust education as compulsory content and the national history curriculum for students ages 11 through 14 in 1991. Following this, the United States started to develop compulsory requirements, and as of 2024, 26 states in the United States require Holocaust education at middle or high school level. Australia started including the Holocaust in the national curriculum as of 2012, and it is taught mostly in high schools, but there's a wide variety of the ways in which and the extent to which it is taught. And Canada has only recently started to require Holocaust education in middle and high schools as of 2024. In English language literature, the most popular works about the Holocaust have largely remained early publications from Europe that were translated into English. In 1952, The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank was translated from Dutch to English. In 1959, Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz was first published in English, and in 1960, Elie Wiesel's Night was translated from French to English and published in New York and London. These books remain the most often used to teach about the Holocaust in high schools in the United States and throughout most of the UK. When the Pulitzer Prize was awarded to Art Spiegelman's Mouse in 1986, it brought prominence to Holocaust literature in new forms, including those stories of the second generation. Though not originally intended for a young audience, Spiegelman's autobiographical work is widely used in contemporary high school settings to learn about the Holocaust. Questions about the ethics and aesthetics emerge when approaching children's and young adult Holocaust literature. Authors must make conscious choices about how to engage young readers and hold their attention, while the subject matter is not intended to delight them, nor to provide a sense of comfort. While possible, the adult mediators who introduce young people to the Holocaust through literary works must make evaluations based on their understanding of their intended audience and their pedagogical goals. So I'm going to talk about some of the early Anglophone literature for children that was popular in the 90s. So The Diary of a Young Girl remained popular, but When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit by Judith Kerr was one of the more popular texts in the UK. The Upstairs Room, The Island on Bird Street by Yuri Orlov, Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen, Number of the Stars by Lois Lowry, and Hitler's Daughter was popular in Australia, written by Australian author Jackie French. At the turn of the century, we started to get new representations of Holocaust literature, and I'm going to present some of those different types here. Now that narratives are increasingly written by third generation authors or authors with no direct personal link to the Holocaust, people have concerns about how to most effectively promote Holocaust memory. Sarah Peeney argues that for contemporary audiences with no direct connection to the Holocaust, to acquire Holocaust memories, that readers must, quote, develop a personal relationship through it with active engagement, or what Marianne Hirsch calls imaginative investment. Intergenerational storytelling, stories of hiding, helper stories, and refugee narratives have been prominent in Holocaust literature since its inception. There was an aversion to including more horrific details of violence Nazis inflicted or graphically portraying genocide in books for young readers. However, in 2000, Elizabeth Baer called for a children's literature of atrocity that, quote, grapples directly with the evil of the Holocaust. Baer argues that such literature should also situate the Holocaust in its proper complexity, in its proper context of complexity, and that it should serve as a warning about the dangers of racism and anti-Semitism and of complacency. Baer's article helped establish a new Holocaust etiquette that opened the door to more experimental forms of representing historical atrocities for young readers. As Baer writes, children's Holocaust literature in our century calls for a consciousness on our part of the crucial need to confront the evil, to contextualize it, to warn children, and to provide them with a framework for consciousness, for making moral choices, and for taking personal responsibility. Reading and learning about the Holocaust can engage young readers in critical thinking, literacy, and citizenship education in ways that promote imaginative engagement and active empathy. So 21st century literature includes those texts that I have listed here. Contemporary authors have found age-appropriate ways for representing atrocity and finding a delicate balance between portraying violence and providing distance. One noticeable strategy contemporary authors use is to gradually introduce the realities of the Holocaust through a child focalizing character and having graphic violence occur off the page, but still feeling its effects. For example, in Then by Morris Gleitzman, Genia and Zelda are hanged in the town square for helping and hiding a Jewish child. Felix reports that I can see clearly, even with smudged glasses, even with tears. Oh, Zelda, oh, Genia. The breeze turns them gently, and now they're facing me. If I go over there and lift them down from these posts and take those ropes from their necks, it's not too late, is it? I close my eyes because I know it's too late. There is no description of Genia and Zelda being taken by the Nazis or of the tension building up to their hanging, yet the impact of their deaths on the main character, Felix, is described in emotionally charged language that invites the reader to empathize with his loss. Readers also realize that many people who did choose to do the right thing lost their lives because of those choices. So 21st century children's Holocaust literature also includes more stories about the Eastern Front and the Bloodlands, where the Nazis and Russian forces oppress, torture, and kill innocent people. In Milkweed by Jerry Spinelli, a teenager in the ghetto starts laughing when the Russians bomb the butcher shop. He says, "What's funny? Everything. They herd us in here like animals. They build a wall around us. They starve us. They freeze us. They beat us. They shoot us. They hang us. They set us on fire. And then the Russians come along and say, that's not enough. You Nazis are too easy on them. So we're going to bomb them." The whole time he speaks, he laughs. He's laughing at the absurdity of the hopeless situation in which they find themselves. The inclusion of violence Russian forces inflicted on people in Eastern Europe appears in many more books in the 21st century, complicating the narrative of Russia as the great liberator of the Allied forces. This is indicative of a shift away from clear good guys and bad guys to one in which young readers are encouraged to see the gray zones of conflict. I'm going to skip ahead to a little bit more about some of the other books that you see here on the slide. Okay, sorry. The diversity of experience has increased. Authors have also found new ways of sharing stories that have not been as broadly heard. For instance, in Refugee, Alan Gratz tells the story of the Jews aboard the St. Louis on their arduous journey to and back from Cuba, and follows the main character Joseph back into the European woods where he is captured and killed by Nazis. While some readers may be familiar with the story of the St. Louis, this book it goes further, and it shows the real effects of such rejection on the parts of Cuba and the United States. Further, Lucy Adlington's The Red Ribbon provides a provocative narrative of a female perpetrator in Auschwitz and the story of the Jewish women seamstress who made beautiful clothes for the wives and daughters of Nazi officers while interred. Whitebird highlights how the Vichy government in France collaborated with the Nazis and passed a series of anti-Jewish laws. It also includes prominently a differently abled child who walks with crutches and who helps to hide his Jewish classmate when the Nazis come to their school to round up Jews for deportation. Julian becomes part of the French resistance, who helped to keep some German forces from getting to Normandy ahead of D-Day. Many of these stories have rarely, if ever, been written about in children's Holocaust literature published in English. The diversity of experiences of the Holocaust has also increased in the stories published. While almost all child characters are forced to adapt to a reality that denies them childhood, the experiences of those childhoods move beyond the existing capital of earlier popular testimonials in English to experiences of children in the resistance, children on the run in the forest of Eastern Europe, children in the camps, and refugee children. Rarely are child characters passive victims of Nazi persecution. Rather, they are agentic, though within the limits of choiceless choices. In Nowhere Boy, Max hides a Syrian refugee boy. In Mapping the Bones, Gittel joins the partisans in the forest and ends up shooting an enemy soldier. Chaya and Esther sneak food and supplies into the Warsaw ghetto. In Resistance and in Refugee, Isabel, a young girl, sells her trumpet to get gasoline for her family's dinghy. Most notably, female protagonists feature in YA fiction more broadly to recover stories of female empowerment and bravery during the time of war. The Red Ribbon is exceptional in its portrayal of an SS guard named Carla, who is a morally complex young female perpetrator. It also suggests a romance between two female prisoners, adding a queer romance element that most Holocaust YA novels do not include. Rather than narratives that focus on early discrimination against Jews as they become increasingly cast out from society, most contemporary narratives begin in times when Jews are already excluded and are facing violent persecution. Further, more novels have focalizing characters who are not in hiding or who are hiding in plain sight. In Resistance by Jennifer Nelson, the protagonist Chaya is able to pass as non-Jewish in Poland when fellow Jewish resistor Esther asks her how she can, quote, mix in with these people like you're Polish and then with ours as a Jew. It's like you have two separate personalities. You wear the crucifix, you lose the Jewish accent out here and present yourself as one of them. Chaya explains, out here, I have to survive. While her circumstances cause identity questions and she grapples with her desire to be who she is, since she is proud of her identity, she understands what is necessary for survival and uses her ability to pass to actively resist Nazi persecution and provide weapons and food to those trapped in the ghettos. In Nowhere Boy, Ahmed, a Syrian refugee, hides in a subcellar in Max's family home in Belgium. When Max discovers him there, Max makes the personal choice to keep quiet about it. He hides and helps Ahmed. When his sister Claire discovers his secret, she tells him that their parents, quote, feel sorry for refugees, but would never allow Ahmed to stay in their house. She becomes emotional and recalls the photograph of a really little kid face down in the water. It was like the world didn't care. Max responds, maybe adults don't care, but we do. This is an example of another trend in YA literature more broadly, children as agents of positive social transformation who are willing to take action when adults around them fail to do so during times of moral crises. Max asks his father if they could host the refugees since their house is big enough, and his father says, we can't do that. I'm an American contractor. It would be way too political for me. To which Max responds, What's political about helping someone? Such moral questions are regularly raised in the novels for contemporary readers to consider. Later in the novel, when an inspector tells Max that Ahmed broke the law by staying in Belgium and you did too by registering him in school, the law is important. Society can't function without it. Max replies, what if the law is wrong? The questions raised by the novel for the contemporary reader allow space for young people to consider their own stances rather than be swayed by the overwhelming rhetoric of mass media about refugees. Understanding that laws can be changed and are not always moral is an important tool for social transformation. In Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children and Jane Yolen's 2018 novel Mapping the Bones, they play with time and blend genres. Ransom Riggs has been known for using the background of the Holocaust to encourage readers' reflection on contemporary forms of othering and oppression, to draw parallels between the monsters that persecuted the main character's grandfather when he was a child in Nazi-occupied Europe to those monsters that are still chasing peculiar children today. We also see in Jane Yolen's novel how the children slip into and out of the past and the present through mixing genres of poetry and memory and present tense writing. Authors are finding new ways to engage young readers and make the past come alive for them in ways that promote empathy and cultural understanding and that actively encourage an ethical position against fascism. Sarah Peeney argues that children's historical fiction offers a positive contribution to preserve and promote Holocaust remembrance through a specific kind of memory, which she terms attitudinal post-memory. Peeney explains that attitudinal post-memory is based on the reader's establishment of a personal emotional link with the Holocaust by means of narrative empathy towards the characters. It is an active kind of memory because it will hopefully convert into an informed, respectful attitude towards peers that opposes the Nazi ideology. And further, Bayer argues that when writing about the Holocaust for young readers, there is a need to create in the child reader a consciousness, a memory, a sense of personal responsibility regarding prejudice, hatred, and racial discrimination. Creating a memory of the Holocaust that engages contemporary readers and encourages their developing attitudes about the world is a grave responsibility. Authors included in my chapter explicitly encourage an ethical stance against war and call for all readers to take responsibility to disrupt oppression and discrimination. Resistance concludes with such an explicit message. I hope you have seen those with uncommon courage, those who look evil in the face and say, this is where it ends. Acknowledging that standing up in the face of perpetration requires uncommon courage invites readers to reflect on the need to do the hard work of making the world remember and the hard work of transforming society so that hatred does not run through the generations. Thank you.
In this chapter, we'll survey the variety of Holocaust texts written for adult readers in English since 2000, with particular attention to 4 critical motifs: intergenerational memory, perpetrator fiction, alternate history, and individual microhistories. Following a review of the field of the 21st century adult Holocaust literature in English, I'll provide examples of each of these phenomena and discuss the rationale underlying trends in this corpus. Now, the very enduring appeal of this field in a changing context deserves our attention. Contemporary works of Holocaust literature from North America, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand demonstrate a persistent fascination with the grim history of the genocide, even as literary representations evolve to innovate new areas of focus and genres of text. What Annette Viaviorka identified as the era of the witness to refer to a period in the late 20th century in which survivor testimony and personal accounts became central to how the Holocaust is remembered and represented in literature, has given way to an era of access, in which individuals personally engage with Holocaust memory on their own terms, through digital platforms, personal travel to sites of memory, and narratives that creatively mediate survivor accounts. While the era of the witness was marked by the centrality of survivor voices and first-hand accounts, the current era is one in which Holocaust narratives are understood on individual terms, sometimes in ironic, sentimental, personal, or emotional ways that defy fidelity to the history of the genocide or remembrance practices of the past. Despite clear signs of literary diversification and cultural dissent, intensive preoccupation with the Holocaust clearly persists. The Holocaust continues to cast a long and somber shadow over English language literature in the 21st century. As in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, Anglophone literary texts about the Nazi genocide of European Jewry still proliferate in abundance through successive waves of publishing that are heterogeneous and distinct from earlier periods of Holocaust literature. This prolific stream of unabated publishing is remarkable, given that the earlier surge of literary writing about the Holocaust in the 1980s and 1990s is often tied to the aging of many Holocaust survivors who began to share their personal stories in testimony, memoirs, and literary texts. If an outpouring of personal memory by first-hand witnesses fueled the rapid growth of Anglophone Holocaust literature in the late 20th century, a different rationale must be found to explain the enduring prominence and appeal of such work in the early 21st century. Texts by descendants of survivors evince this multi-generational perspective. For instance, the American author Jonathan Safran Foer's novels Everything is Illuminated from 2002 and Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close from 2005 articulate an understanding of the past that's mediated by grandchildren's relationship to their grandparents. These texts interweave multiple narrative strands that layer a generational perspective of imaginative reconstruction of the past with the later descendants' lived experience. A quotation in Incredibly Close encapsulates the links of trauma shared by family members in the wake of overwhelming loss. Foer's fiction also demonstrates an experimental use of diverse narrative forms, such as magical realism, postmodern forms of dialogue, and graphical typefaces. It's similar to Anita Diamond's Boston Girl, a very different realistic work that weaves a narrative that spans continents and generations to explore the lingering effects of the Holocaust on a Jewish family who emigrates to America. Kaluki Nights, by the British author Howard Jacobson, interrogates the legacy of the Holocaust for generations of British Jews, insulated from any direct contact with it. This novel's comic deconstruction of that legacy, in order to parody the way in which the Holocaust has been fetishized, is voiced by the author of Jacobson's Holocaust-obsessed protagonist Max, as she scolds him. The only camp you ever went to was Butlins. This story is that of a young boy who is searching for the clues of his past in an experience that he did not know firsthand. Moreover, the widening of temporal distance from the genocide allows these writers to explore the past with greater freedom. This effect is apparent in the increase in the number of literary works that treat the Holocaust with more pronounced moral ambiguity and creative license. Emily Budick critically identifies this dynamic as the proclivity for, quote, an ambiguous and morally upsetting narrative that has changed the intended reader's position and relative moral proximity to the events being portrayed. In addition, the rise of perpetrator fiction and burgeoning interest in alternate histories are characteristic features of Anglophone 21st century Holocaust literature that express the desire for a more nuanced approach to collective memory, as well as unfettered creative license. Novels such as Martin Amis's 2014 Zone of Interest from Britain attempt to delve into what Saul Friedlander once called the moral abyss of perpetrator mentality. Such texts push the boundaries of the genre by exploring a perspective previously considered taboo. Nonetheless, this trend remains contested. Critics such as Aaron McLaughlin and Robert Eaglestone argue that the literary landscape attempts to reveal the anathema contents of a perpetrator's mind, while simultaneously trying to sidestep or occlude it, to avoid navigating an ethical minefield of perspectives that can scarcely be successfully crossed without succumbing to identification with murderers. In addition, troubling elements in contemporary society, such as the global resurgence of virulent anti-Semitism and widespread turns towards ideologically extreme positions in politics the world over, spur authors to approach the Holocaust not merely as the illumination of a grim past, but a potential reflection of an ominous future. Such dark visions of the future reread the past as even more horrific than it was, to explore chilling scenarios of alternate history. What if Roosevelt had been defeated? What if Nazi Germany had won? What if the Jews had not found refuge in Israel? Such stories are played out in novels such as Philip Roth's The Plot Against America and Michael Chabon's The Yiddish Policeman's Union, or the Uber series by Kieran Gillen, or Dominion by C.J. Sansom. Such works consider how protagonists, and by extension us all, might be entangled in subversive efforts to reclaim a free society. These texts are just as animated by visions of the past as they are by dark fears of the future that see a correspondence between the events of the 20th century and the worst possibilities of the 21st. Even as the Holocaust recedes in time, it becomes more hauntingly relevant for many who are concerned about the state of civilization. Becca Cantor, the editorial director of the Jewish Book Council in the United States, says, "The Holocaust continues to compel readers and writers because it seems so unfathomable. But at the same time, it is an embodiment of our fears." These several factors have shaped 21st century Anglophone Holocaust literature and help account for some of the emergent features that distinguish it from earlier modes of writing about this genocide. The growing temporal distance from the historical events of the past century are counterbalanced by a troubling awareness of their increasing relevance for events today, and the emergence of a new cohort of authors who tackle this topic differently than was done in the past century. With the passing of survivors who witnessed the events firsthand, or even of bystanders who lived through it, few works by first-hand witnesses are now written, while far more are written by professional authors, many of whom lack any personal tie to the Holocaust. This influx of new authors has led to innovations of new genres and forms introduced since the turn of the century, and these include representations of the Holocaust not only as an historical event, but as a legacy, allegory, or warning that continues to shape individual lives and communities across generations. This new landscape of memory and literature reflects a growing awareness of the Holocaust's enduring cultural impact, with lingering effects on cultural memory practices, moral imagination, and the struggle to understand humanity's worst and best impulses. While the imperative of Holocaust remembrance and the exploration of its traumatic legacy remain unassailably important in the 21st century, the charge of memory has shifted in a substantial way towards contemporary media rife with historical misinformation. Critical discourse has emerged surrounding the seemingly symbiotic enthusiasm for Holocaust fiction among readers and publishers, and moreover, Holocaust memory is no longer separate or politically neutral, but is in fact infected by political debate about competitive victimhood and contemporary atrocity. This opaque environment created by digital misinformation and political polarization heightens concerns about the issues of historical accuracy in fictional narratives. Some works, especially those about individual victims or microhistories, have been criticized for containing factual discrepancies. A case in point is the commercially successful 2018 novel, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, by Heather Morris, an Australian author originally from New Zealand. In The Tattooist of Auschwitz, a tale that is presented as historical fiction based on the life of Leo Sokolov, an Auschwitz survivor whom Morris met late in Sokolov's life, a story that is set in Auschwitz-Birkenau is criticized for a host of factual inaccuracies. These historical errors were addressed in an exhaustive fact-finding article by the Research Center of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. The article by the museum states that the book contains numerous errors and information inconsistent with the facts, as well as exaggerations, misinterpretations, and understatements. The historical audit concludes on an acid note. Morris, quote, had the ambition to write a novel similar to a document and wanted memory and history to tread in perfect harmony in the book. Unfortunately, in spite of the help of archivists, as can be deduced from the acknowledgments included in the book, she was unable to accomplish this intention. But in assailing Morris's novel for being an illusion of a document rather than a genuine historical report, the museum's indictment unwittingly offers a vindication of the role of fiction. For literature, especially fiction, conjures up an illusion of reality that can be even more compelling than a carefully crafted historical report. Beyond historical fidelity and accuracy, commentators have raised additional anxieties regarding thematic choices prevalent in Anglophone 21st century Holocaust literature. A frequent point of criticism centers on the privileging of the non-Jewish savior narrative. These narratives are a non-Jewish character as the central figure who rescues or assists Jewish victims. This focus, critics argue, inadvertently diminishes the agency and resilience of Jewish individuals during the Holocaust. Furthermore, anxieties exist concerning the potential for Holocaust fiction to unintentionally solidify a singular definition of Jewish identity solely rooted in suffering and victimhood. This reductionist approach risks obscuring the tapestry so rich of Jewish culture before the war and the experiences that existed during the Holocaust. This analysis underscores the need for a nuanced approach towards Holocaust fiction and its focus of representation. While perpetuating memory and fostering empathy remains a valuable lens through which one reads about the event, it is necessary to ensure accuracy, a multifaceted understanding of the Jewish identity, and an approach that balances responsibility to the past and the future. English texts written since 2000 endeavor to expand the range of verisimilitude in Holocaust representation by exploring new terrain in depiction of this horrific event. These include attempts to imagine how the Nazi perpetrators conceived of themselves, how descendants of the victims relate to the experiences of their forebears, how history may have developed otherwise, and how individual stories can be relayed by authors with vastly different personal coordinates, literary skills, and personal background.